I recognize that song. I was very, very lucky. I grew up poor, which meant that I was in a black neighborhood, and I had as my refuge a soul food restaurant where, in addition to the best jukebox I've ever seen, there was food that hadn't been burned to death. My mother's kitchen was smoke all the time. I never in a million years imagined that I would get to work later with the likes of Ray Charles and Solomon Burke and Ike Turner and Billy Preston and people like that. Ray, I was asked to write something about Ray, and I said I would happily do it on two conditions: that I could tell the truth and that I could have serious access to Ray. So I had to go through hoops in the form personified by a guy named Joe Adams, who became a good friend, and then ultimately got to Ray, and he and I hit it off really, really well. And when what I was doing was over, he said, I want us to stay in touch. And I said, I would love that, figuring, yeah, likely story. Well, one day Ray called me up and he said, you gotta do me a solid. And I said, what's that? He said, I'm gonna be interviewed, and you know how I hate being interviewed, and the guy who will not be named, who's gonna interview me today, has a terrible stutter, and I will refuse to be in the same room with him. So you got to come by. So I said, okay, I'll come by. And when I got there, he said, you're doing the interview. I said, oh, come on, Ray. He said, no, you're doing the interview. And the guy showed up, and he turned green when he realized what was happening, but he couldn't go back to his editor and say, I walked out. So I started doing the interview, speaking in the third person. And Ray said, no, man, you got to say I. So I started doing it as Ray Charles. I never did this, but I did the interview, and when it was over, he said, gee, that was great, we'll do it again sometime. And it became an ongoing thing, and he'd call me, he said, I got another fucking interview, would you come by? Okay, I'll come by. And then we'd do the interview, and we had lunch. The story that seemed to tickle every interviewer went as follows. And I won't do it as I'll do it as he. Ray was with Atlantic Records when he was approached by ABC Paramount by a guy named Sam Clark, who said, I really want you to sign with us. And every time Ray said, well, no, thank you, Clark upped the ante. And finally, Ray went to Ahmet Ertegun, who remained a dear friend until Ray's death, and he said, look, I love it here. I don't want to leave Atlantic, but would you do me a favor? Don't beat the price he's going to pay me. Will you at least match it? And Ahmet said, what are you, crazy? We're a little label that does singles. They're a huge company. They were a conglomerate before anybody coined that term. Go with them. Ray didn't. So Sam Clark came over to Ray and said, what's it going to take? And Ray said, well, you know, I've been thinking, I would really like complete artistic autonomy. Seeing Ray Charles, the guy said, sure, figuring Ray couldn't even spell the term. Ray, of course, was about the smartest person I've ever known. He said, sure, you got it. Will you sign? And Ray said, nah, something else. And he said, what's that? He said, well, I want to own my own masters. Pavarotti doesn't own his own masters. Sinatra doesn't own his own masters. They finally worked it out, and a press conference was called. And so Sam Clark addressed, it wasn't the media in those days, it was the press, and he said, here at ABC Paramount, we have the biggest and best in every field, in classical, in pop, in show tunes, in jazz. We have the best, and now we have the very best R&B artist in the world. Any questions? And somebody said, Mr. C, what are you going to do for your first session there? And he said, country. And everybody laughed. No, seriously, Mr. Charles, what are you going to do? He said, I'm going to do country. At which point they had to bring in ERs, they had to bring in EMTs to deal with Sam Clark, who was having palpitations. And he said, Ray, but no, man, I'm going to do country. Well, the first single was something called I Can't Stop Loving You, which was the biggest selling single until the arrival of the Beatles. And that was part of an album called Modern Sounds in Country and Western, which was the foremost selling album, again, until the Beatles. So Ray showed him.